Russia has now pulled the two commanders with the best track record on the battlefield out of Ukraine. As we approach 2 weeks since the Wagner-led mutiny, both Yevgeny Prigozhin and General Surovikin are out of the fight, and their futures remain unknown. Surovikin took command of the war in Ukraine last fall after Ukrainian forces retook Kharkiv. That offensive showed just how thin the Russian lines were, at least up north, as Ukrainian forces, sometimes in Humvees, drove straight through and immediately threatened rear areas. In a very short period of time, Ukraine retook substantial chunks of territory as Russian forces were forced to fall back. Upon taking command, Surovikin set about changing Russia's defensive posture all along the line of contact. The Kherson counteroffensive was already ongoing when he took command, but he made the decision to withdraw Russian forces from the West Bank to more defensible positions in the east, essentially choosing to use the river as a defensive obstacle rather than have it hindering their abilities to resupply and reinforce the troops just across it. That wasn't exactly well received all across Russia, but big picture was a pretty smart move. Essentially, as Russia wasn't planning an offensive push in that area anytime soon, moving back across the river saved them an enormous amount of time, energy, and manpower in having to maintain an isolated force under fire. When this current Ukrainian offensive kicked off, I think a lot of folks were hoping, maybe not expecting, but hoping to see a repeat of Kharkiv, an early breakthrough and rapid exploitation that leads to pretty substantial gains. One of the main reasons we haven't seen that is Surovikin's move to establish more of a defense in depth, which is exactly what Ukraine is slowly fighting through right now. Eventually, Surovikin was moved out of overall command and into the role of overseeing all air forces in the Ukraine theater of operations. There are some rumors that inside of the Kremlin, people were saying he wasn't offensive-minded enough and should have continued pushing forward. That's speculation, but it's not crazy, given that he was followed by Gerasimov, who immediately picked up the attack in multiple areas of the front. There was some sort of relationship between Surovikin and Wagner's Prigozhin. It sounds like the extent of that is something Russia is trying to figure out right now, but at the very least, Prigozhin seemed to like General Surovikin and asked for him to be the direct point of contact between Wagner and the Russian Ministry of Defense. When the Wagner mutiny kicked off, General Surovikin put out a video calling on Prigozhin to stop, but shortly after everything calmed down, reports started to come out that Surovikin may have, at the very least, known about the mutiny before it started. Russia hasn't really said much officially, just leaks coming from unnamed sources saying that Surovikin has been detained. But as of today, July 6th, he hasn't been seen or heard from since the mutiny. Again, at least at the highest levels of Russian military leadership, this has been one of their top performers during the war in Ukraine, and now he's nowhere to be seen. In terms of Prigozhin, since the end of this mutiny, he has put out a few audio statements, all of which were pretty calm compared to what he's put out in the past. The statements saying things like, "Our march for justice was successful, and thank you for all your hard work." But questions about his status and future are also unknown. Prigozhin sort of gets viewed as the Wagner guy, but he's actually much more involved in the war. He runs the Internet Research Agency, an internet troll farm that pushes Russian disinformation all around the world, as well as the Concord Group, the food service contractor that was working under a $9.6 billion contract to feed the Russian army. So Prigozhin's absence and unknown status going forward is more than just the Wagner Group on the battlefield. That entity is likely to dissolve, merge with the Ministry of Defense, or some combination of the two, and that includes their overseas operations in Africa and the Middle East. It sounds like those, for now at least, will fall under the purview of the Russian Ministry of Defense in some way, shape, or form, but it's not exactly clear quite yet what that'll look like. Now, Russia doesn't work exactly like the United States, so I wouldn't be shocked to find out that Prigozhin's private holdings are all of a sudden owned and operated by someone a little bit closer to the Kremlin so they can continue operation. But the risk of some sort of turmoil within these organizations is certainly present. I mean, any change in management at any firm comes with hiccups. Have to imagine it would be the same here, especially if it's a forced takeover in the middle of a war. But as of now, the uncertainty continues. Technically, Prigozhin is still the leader of each of these organizations, but it's hard to imagine Putin will allow him to retain that level of power and influence after what he just did a couple weeks ago. I mean, news just came out that Russia is going through and searching Prigozhin's homes, and turns out he had quite the arsenal. Looks like a few AKs, an M4, a shotgun, maybe a 9mm back there. If he were in the US, I'd say that's a man who knows about Gunspot, who just happens to be the sponsor of this video. Gunspot is an online listing and auction site for both new and used firearms, accessories, ammo, and more from sellers all across the United States, which I guess rules out Prigozhin. But for all of us here in the United States, that means access to thousands of buyers across the country with no out-of-state sales tax or hidden fees. Shifting over to the battlefield where Ukraine continues their offensive, seeing progress around Bakhmut and Velika Novosilka. At Bakhmut, most of the Ukrainian progress has come in the south towards Klishivka, where elements have pushed 3 to 4 kilometers through Russian positions over the last week. There's also a little progress north towards the M03 highway, but that's an area that's seen a lot of back and forth, with territory changing hands quite a bit as of late. Additionally, there were some rumors of Ukrainian forces beginning to fight on the outskirts of Bakhmut itself, but I've not really seen anything to confirm that. I mean, it wouldn't be much of a stretch. The lines are just outside the edge of the city in the west. I just haven't seen confirmation of that action. The fight at Bakhmut is interesting. The Ukrainian push in the south is understandable, fits with the larger strategy of splitting Russian forces, maybe making their way to the Crimean Peninsula. Most analysts expected some sort of assault in that direction. But pushing east through Bakhmut is a little bit different. I mean, there's a lot of political value in retaking Bakhmut after how much Russia publicized its capture. And if Ukraine was able to push further, the defense in that area of the front is not quite as deep as what we see further south. Of course, it could be a diversion to pull Russian forces in so they can't be utilized elsewhere. But overall, it's just hard to tell what the overarching goal is around Bakhmut. It's just not strategic enough location to where taking the city changes the course of the war. The second piece that stands out to me is that when Wagner forces left Bakhmut back in early June, they were replaced all across the line by regular Russian units. So these are new troops, not necessarily newly trained, but new to the area. On the other hand, most reports are showing that the Ukrainian forces involved in this attack are those that have been fighting at Bakhmut for months, not any of the new brigades outfitted with Western gear. An argument could be made here that even though the Ukrainian forces in the area were depleted over the course of the last few months, they know the terrain better than the newly arrived Russian units and are able to use that to their advantage as they attack, which is kind of the opposite of what we're seeing elsewhere along the front. This last week has also seen Ukraine advance on the Velika Novosilka front, pushing a bit further into Russian positions. It's not a ton, but it is forward progress, and if Ukraine wants to push Russia out of their territory, they have to advance. Over the last little bit here, we've seen comments from leaders in both Ukraine and the United States talking about how this offensive is playing out slower than expected. And this is one of those situations where more than one thing can be true at once. It does appear that the operation is not progressing as fast as some had hoped, and it's also true that it's continuing forward, seeing new progress every day. There's also the question of a possible Ukrainian bridgehead in Kherson. A little over a week ago, reports started to come out that Ukraine had crossed the Dnieper and were holding a small position on the Russian-occupied side of the river. It's a pretty precarious position, but then a few days passed and they were still there. Now we're coming up on 2 weeks since those initial reports, and even Russian forces like Rybar are calling the situation there tense. Ukraine hasn't put out a lot of footage from their end of the fight around this bridgehead, which makes sense, given that Russia is having to estimate the strength and exact location of those Ukrainian positions. Russia, on the other hand, has continued to put out footage showing strikes in the area, which, of course, are often followed by the Russian Ministry of Defense saying the entire Ukrainian force was killed and the area is secure. I think they've announced that like 2 or 3 times now. I don't know if it's a platoon of 30 men holding down that bank or something substantially larger, but I do feel pretty confident saying that as of today, July 6th, Ukraine does still have a presence on the Russian-occupied side. You know, an easy win in the information war would be for Russian troops to take pictures or videos down by the Antonovsky Bridge where the Ukrainian forces are dug in. Until that or something like that is released by Russia, it seems like the fighting there is ongoing. Over the last few days, both Ukraine and Russia have accused the other of planning to attack the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which could potentially lead to a major disaster in the surrounding areas. Ukrainian President Zelensky said that Russia has placed what appear to be explosive charges on the roofs of several buildings, adding, quote, "The world sees that the only source of danger to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is Russia and no one else." Adding, quote, "Unfortunately, there was no timely and large-scale response to the terrorist attack on the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant, and this may incite the Kremlin to commit new evil. It is the responsibility of everyone in the world to stop it. No one can stand aside," end quote. Meanwhile, Russia claimed that Ukraine was planning to attack the power plant with drones and placed the blame on Russia. Now, I know the conversation, should something happen here, will trend towards asking who will benefit more from an attack here. And the bottom line is that nobody comes out of this clean, but there are some short and long-term effects to think about. Now, there's a wide range of what an attack on the power plant could mean. Worst case, there's radiation leakage and the surrounding area becomes an uninhabitable wasteland. Now, if Russia's goal is to turn Ukraine into some sort of rump state with too much baggage for NATO to want to hitch their wagon to, I guess you could make the argument that a massive contaminated zone in the middle of the country works in Russia's favor. That's pretty dark. On the other side, a deliberate Russian attack on a nuclear power plant could be viewed by NATO as an escalation of the war and may prompt some member states to want to intervene directly. I'm not sure the U.S. would put boots on the ground in the immediate aftermath of this hypothetical attack, but there are some pretty hawkish member states in Eastern Europe who may decide on action. More than anything, since the start of this full-scale invasion, a Russian attack on a nuclear power plant very well may pull portions of NATO directly into this fight. Again, though, that's just my personal speculation around a hypothetical event, so take it with a grain of salt. In the near term, let's just hope the power plant remains stable and no attacks are directed its way. But that's all I got for now. Be sure to check out the national security sit-reps I put out on Substack. The link is in the description below if interested. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.